So hello and welcome to the video. I went on a cruise, but was it any good given everything going on? Circumstances made it different in some ways, but familiar in many others. In this video I'll talk generally about the experience and answer some important questions. How did the ongoing restrictions impact upon the overall experience? Indeed, did any of those differences actually improve the cruise experience? And I'll answer the biggest question of all. Is cruising right now normal enough to be worthwhile? If those sound like questions you'd like to see answered, then stick around. Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So hit subscribe to see where I go next and perhaps get some inspiration for your next trip. I've talked about cruising in a couple of previous videos and I've now had 3 cruises cancelled over the last year. 7 months ago in this video, I said that a cruise under COVID restrictions would feel like swapping one lockdown for another. But as travel opportunities remained extremely limited as summer approached, I relaxed that view. I'll talk in more detail about how much it costs later in the video, but I'll say up front that I paid for my own cruise and Celebrity did not know I was travelling. I sailed on Celebrity Silhouette, a Solstice class ship in the Celebrity fleet. It weighs in at 122,000 tonnes and looks huge, although it's only about half the weight of the largest cruise ships out there. It has capacity for over 2,800 passengers, but the first very major difference to a normal cruise was that government restrictions meant that occupancy was limited to only 1,000 passengers. When fully staffed, there'd be 1,500 crew. I don't know exactly how many crew were aboard my cruise, but they could well have outnumbered the passengers. The result was that the service was excellent. A couple of small issues which I'll put down to the team still getting up to speed after a year's layoff. This was the 3rd cruise for the ship, and it felt like the crew were even more pleased to be sailing than some of us passengers were. So, was sailing in a more than half empty ship a good thing? You might assume it was, but I'm not sure. Positives were that it was never difficult to get a seat at a bar or a lounger by the pool. Those seats and loungers were also nicely spaced out due to social distancing. I don't love the usual practice of butting pool loungers up against each other, leaving zero space between you and the stranger next to you. On the other hand, it was a pretty quiet cruise. We had a half-empty boat, plus I felt that the average age of those on board was higher than usual, as only fully vaccinated people could sail. So the cruise lacked some energy. Smaller venues were okay, but the main atrium on the ship is actually quite small and the events held there were pretty lively, but it was more of a struggle to create an atmosphere in the main theatre. I actually felt a wee bit sorry for some of the performers who found the limited attendances quite tough to engage. Social distancing was a recurring theme on board, even though England's legal restrictions were lifted mid-cruise. More on that in a moment. There was plenty of signage reminding passengers to space themselves out, and it really wasn't an inconvenience at all. The major consequence was that travelling groups were not allowed to mingle, so you couldn't be seated with people you didn't know at dinner. That annoyed a few people. The dining tables were also well spaced out, so you also couldn't really converse across tables in the way that you normally would. Another obvious point to address is face masks. I didn't realise that face mask bags were a thing. Face masks were required when moving around inside, but you could remove them when seated in a bar or restaurant, although they did ask you to keep them on in the theatre. They weren't required outside. These rules were very well observed by the passengers, so much so that I never saw any crew member needing to enforce those regulations. The crew were always masked, except when performing, and if a crew member needed to address us, as they did when briefing us prior to excursions, they asked our permission to remove their masks, which I thought was a nice touch. I only saw one instance of a crew member not wearing a mask properly, and that was a fairly senior officer during the captain's reception. It was outdoors, but I won't embarrass them by identifying them here. It's been widely discussed that the buffet experience is now different. To reduce the risk of infection through sharing serving implements, staff now plonk the goodies onto your plate rather than allowing you to self-serve. It worked well, although asking for 2 sausages occasionally resulted in you being given 5. On one occasion I spent a couple of seconds looking at something and trying to work out what it was, only for the server to beetle over with a bowl of it a moment later. Many think this is an improvement to the buffet experience, and I can see their point, although it did slow the whole process down a little, which might be an issue on a fuller cruise. More broadly, I sensed that the food offering had been narrowed a little in the buffet and the main dining room, although that was understandable with fewer passengers to feed, and it really wasn't a big deal at all. One more point on the restrictions. I'd been told on the phone prior to the cruise that if restrictions were relaxed on shore during the cruise, they'd aim to also relax them on board. That wasn't a firm commitment though, and we did visit Northern Ireland where restrictions did not relax that week. But I had an expectation that the issue would at least be addressed on board, even if nothing then changed. But very oddly, no one on board said anything. And when I spoke to guest relations, they were oddly evasive about the whole thing. It really wasn't a big deal and the onboard restrictions didn't ruin the experience, but not even addressing the issue was odd. To take the cruise, we all needed to be double vaxxed with more than 2 weeks having passed since the second jab. We also needed to show a negative PCR test swabbed within 3 days of boarding. That's 3 days rather than 72 hours, by the way. Celebrity has done a deal with Eurofins, meaning you could get the test for free at a Eurofin location, but if that didn't work for you, you could get your own test done and Celebrity would reimburse the cost up to £100. I got mine done in Boots for 85 quid, which was a straightforward process. Uncomfortable, but straightforward. The boarding process was very smooth. You needed to book an arrival slot which served to space passenger arrivals out, and inside the terminal there were plenty of staff on hand. The numerous checks were staggered, so you kept moving and never really felt like you were in a queue. The proof of vaccination and PCR test results were diligently photographed. I made it from the car to the ship in around 20 minutes, and probably half of that was spent walking, as it was a decent hike to get onto the ship. I had expected to be asked to wear a tracking device so close contacts could be monitored in the event of an infection being found on board, but I wasn't. I don't know whether this was something that had been dropped or whether it was never in Celebrity strategy. Disembarkation was also a breeze, very pleasant to not have passports and customs to worry about.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
One consequence of the restrictions not being relaxed mid-cruise was that I was only able to get off the ship as part of an official excursion. That wasn't a huge problem as I had enough onboard credit to be able to afford tours in both of our port stops, but it would have been very irritating if I'd been relying on getting off independently. Not that there's that much close to the dock in Belfast, but even with a tour booked in Liverpool, it would have been nice to have been able to get off and wander around. Oddly, things felt stricter in Liverpool, where restrictions had been lifted ashore, than they were in Belfast, where they hadn't. Both of the tours I took were interesting, in particular a show we saw in the basement of a pub in Belfast, which was excellent. But I have to say that excursions were the area where the restrictions had the biggest negative impact on the overall experience, particularly in Liverpool, where we weren't allowed off the tour bus at all. It was a 6-day cruise, so out of the 140 hours of the trip, I was off the ship for perhaps 6 hours, which wasn't much. I've toyed with the idea of taking a transatlantic cruise, which usually involves 6 consecutive sea days, so as I spent 96% of this trip on the ship, it ended up being quite a similar experience. I wouldn't say I got bored on this trip, but let's say it did bring home to me how important I feel port stops are. So what did I pay? I think I got a pretty good deal with Celebrity. I paid £1,029, which included 4 sweeteners. Firstly, there was no single supplement. This is a really smart move from Celebrity, as long as they face capacity constraints. They're not going to lose revenue by allowing one person to occupy a double cabin. There will still be hundreds of empty cabins. That's something I'm not sure the other cruise lines still operating around the UK have worked out, meaning single travellers are still sometimes penalised when perhaps they don't need to be right now. The second bonus was that my room was upgraded to concierge class, which brings some perks and benefits over and above a normal balcony cabin. Thirdly, parking at the port in Southampton was included. And finally, Celebrity paid for the pre-departure COVID test, as I mentioned earlier. Then, to sweeten the deal even further, for an additional £25 a night, I added the Elevate package. All Celebrity fares include tips, a standard drinks package and access to basic Wi-Fi, and the Elevate package adds an upgrade to the premium drinks package plus $300 of onboard spending. That's around £220 of onboard spending for a cost of £125, which is obscenely generous, and I'm not convinced it's what Celebrity thought it was offering, but I'll take it. It allowed me to comfortably afford shore excursions in both ports we visited, with enough left over for 2 dinners in specialty restaurants. I mentioned earlier that I spoke to Celebrity before the cruise about the likelihood of restrictions lifting. During that conversation, the agent was perhaps a little unguarded and said that Celebrity was not expecting to make a profit as long as capacity was reduced. They were happy to operate at a loss in order to build confidence in their ability to operate a cruise safely. That might explain the generosity of the pricing. As I look at upcoming cruises through September, that extreme generosity doesn't seem to be still available, even if there are still some very good deals out there through September. Celebrity is a premium cruise line, not a luxury line like Seven Seas or Regent, but it's certainly a step up from Royal Caribbean, Norwegian and Carnival. But at those prices, it's a really tempting proposition. The restrictions did sometimes get in the way, but there were long stretches where things felt, dare I say it, normal. And if Celebrity relaxes their onboard restrictions in line with the countries they're servicing, then it is really tempting to jump on that great pricing. You're getting a lot of cruise for the money. So thanks for watching. Please like this video if you got something from it, leave me a comment and please subscribe if you're new. And I'll see you all again in the next one. Goodbye.